Hi, this is the History of Children's Literature Part 2, and we're going to be beginning by talking about the rise of the picture book in the early 19th century. So at the top there are listed some illustrators that were some of the most famous English and American illustrators of their time. Publishers would hire the illustrators to produce the work for many different children's books, especially as the printing techniques improved and the color illustrations were more common in books. Randolph Caldecott was so influential that the Caldecott Medal is now the illustration award in the United States, and in Britain they call their illustration award the Kate Greenaway Medal. Randolph Caldecott is often known as the first illustrator to show action in pictures, such as his book, The Diverting History of John Gilpin, and that's one of his most best remembered illustrations. In fact, it's on the cover of the Caldecott Medal. He also, Howard Pyle was known for doing stunning illustrations in classics like The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, of great renown. He also wrote that book. So the domain of children's books was firmly established with the dawning of the 20th century. The century began with a lot of groundbreaking events. Beatrix Potter wrote and illustrated her enduring tale, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, which is known as the first modern picture story book, which means it was written for children with illustrations. She matched the colored illustrations with text page for page, thus using the pictures to share in the storytelling process. Peter Rabbit was one of the first characters known to be a children's book character. Another first occurring book in the early 20th century was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and it was known to be one of the first modern fantasy books. Usually fantasy had been kind of the domain of the Europeans, but The Wizard of Oz was the first modern fantasy written in America. Other enduring classics that were written were Peter Pan in Kensington Garden, Anne of Green Gables, the granddaddy of animal fantasies, which is The Wind in the Willows, and another trend-setting fantasy was Winnie the Pooh, published in 1926. The illustrator from America, who was known to be equal to Beatrix Potter from England, is someone named Wanda Gag. Her book, Millions of Cats, is credited to be the first American picture storybook. Another landmark picture book of the time was Goodnight Moon, written by Margaret Wise Brown, which is still known to be published as one of the best bedtime stories, as well as Madeline, written by Ludwig Bemelmans. Dr. Seuss also had a book published. He was known to be widely known as an American children's book author and illustrator, and his book, To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, was his first published book. Another modern-day classic is the book Make Way for Ducklings, which is an endearing tale of a spunky duck and the 8 ducklings that follow her around through Boston. While those books were definitely noteworthy and popular with the public, there were also other popular books that were considered lesser quality, and those are the books published by Edward Stoudemire. Stoudemire Syndicate was a publishing phenomenon that began in the late 19th century. Edward Stoudemire saw the potential to produce more books that were fiction series for young readers. So typically, Edward Stoudemire would outline the plots, and then he would hand over all of the writing to his ghostwriters or his junior editors. And so the following series here, the Rover Boys, the Bobbsey Twins, Tom Swift, the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, and the Babysitters Club, were all written by ghostwriters The ideas were brainstormed by Edward Stoudemire, but most of them were written by just people on the publishing staff. So if you know of any of the authors, such as the author of Nancy Drew, to be known as Carolyn Keene, there is no person named Carolyn Keene. Or Franklin Dixon for the Hardy Boys, there is no Franklin Dixon. So that's usually a shocking revelation to people. In the latter half of the 20th century, because the world of children's books was becoming so prevalent, the publishing world began to want to honor the books that really stood out. In 1956, the Hans Christian Andersen Award was created, and that is an international award. The American Library Association began a few different awards, such as their notables list, the Newbery, and the Caldecott. And other organizations like the National Council of Teachers of English began their awards. One's called the OrbisPictus Award, and they also give an Excellence in Poetry Award. In the 1960s, there was a financial boom, and there were many large government grants that would help fund public school libraries. And so the children's publishing, most of their money went to the schools. The books were usually hardbound and durable for school libraries and also public libraries. More books were published and sold than ever before, and there were more awards given out than ever before. At that same time, there was also in our American culture an age of new realism. There were taboos that used to be placed on literature in general that were being lifted. People wanted to talk about issues that in the past might have been taboo, such as death, divorce, alcoholism, and child abuse. So many of the books that began in the 1960s started to show a more real view of life. Noteworthy books at that time were Where the Wild Things Are, Harriet the Spy, The Snowy Day, which is the first picture book published that shows a black child as a protagonist without any negative stereotyping, and that book also won the Caldecott Medal in 1963. And another noteworthy book are the series, The Book of Three, which is a fantasy series by Lloyd Alexander. In the 1970s, a lot of the federal monies that went to school libraries started to go away, and so the market for children's books shifted from the school market into a more consumer market. So bookstore purchases were going to be made by the parent or the consumer. So with that in mind, a lot of the publishing houses began to make books that were what I call manipulative type books that might get the attention of someone who's spending their own personal money. Books like that included scratch and sniff books, touchy-feely or texture books, books too fragile for the school library, such as pop-up books, toy books, books with records, and other type of books shown in this picture there. Picture books continued to be published, but the illustrations had to be bigger and brighter and more flashy to get people's attention. Also, the series books that were of a cheaper price, such as those by the Stoudemire Syndicate, sold quickly, and so more of those books were published in the 1970s. Some of the books that were realistic fiction were also highly popular in the 70s. Some of the books for children started taking on shocking and realistic themes, such as those by Judy Blume, titled Are You There, Margaret? Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and the book Forever. And also books that would talk about death more, like My Brother Sam is Dead. And those other ones listed there also tackled often unpopular viewpoints or points of view that were silenced in the past. Journey to Topaz was about a Japanese concentration camp, and the two listed there at the bottom were books that won the Caldecott and Newbery awards for that year, and they were depicting stories from an African American point of view. So books with underrepresented populations were being recognized among the awards. So in the 1980s and in the 1990s, the publishing world started getting more institutional purchases back into the schools. The whole language way of teaching reading became more popular, and so people wanted to teach with literature books again, and so the retail market continued, but schools started finding more money to buy books. Another interesting thing about the 1980s and the 1990s was the different corporations that started getting involved with publishing. Larger corporations that had no relation to books started buying up the publishing houses. For example, the Macmillan Publishing Company purchased Athenaeum along with some other publishing houses until its children's book division had 11 imprints. Then Simon & Schuster bought Macmillan, and Paramount bought Simon & Schuster. And soon Viacom, the cable TV giant, snapped up Paramount, and so the children's book publishing became an even bigger business. Simon & Schuster is now got 3 imprints under it. It now has an imprint called Books for Young Readers, Athenaeum Books for Young Readers, and the Margaret K. McElderry Books. In addition to the large number of publishing houses and their imprints, there was a new genre that was born called the I Can Read or the beginning reader type of books. In those type of books, they would label it like the picture there, and they would take almost any story and use simpler vocabulary to make the reading age audience a lower grade or a lower age. And so with that, books that were previously published could be republished with simpler vocabulary. And those can be found now very commonly. As a teacher, it's somewhat frustrational, and also as a parent, because the different publishing houses have different ways of leveling their books, and so you really have to be aware of how they level. But it's definitely a genre of its own within the picture book world. And also in the 1990s, poetry anthologies and poetry began to be more recognized in the award circles and in the publishing world. So where are we in the 2000s? The publishing book world now focuses on a few different things, and usually it doesn't reach the schools for many years, but what's popular right now in the publishing of children's books has to do with the new literacies. That's a term people use when they talk about how children learn to read. It used to be that people felt you had to have a book in your hand, but there's a lot of debate going on in a controversial way that children don't need a book. They can learn from online digital sources, and there's research going on about it. But because of that, a lot of the publishing houses now have their books in a digital format available to schools and the consumer online. There's also the topics of metafiction and postmodern picture books. We're going to be discussing that in a different presentation, but those are things in the 2000s that break some of the traditional structures and rules of children's literature. There's also the Harry Potter phenomenon that happened in the 2000s, which we talked about in a different presentation, but it kind of gave a jolt to the children's book world and definitely gave adults a different view of how interesting children's literature can be, and also the author's influence on the children's book industry. Another thing in the 2000s has been the genres of young adult literature, and just recently the new adult literature, which is aimed at more older adolescents into adulthood, those who are have money to spend on books, but they're not necessarily young protagonists in the story. And finally, another addition in the 2000s has been that the Library of Congress has taken note of the influence of children's literature on literacy and children, and so they have begun appointing an ambassador for the young people's literature for the last few years, and that's always an author or an illustrator of influence, and so it's interesting to show that we do recognize it as a nation. Hope you enjoyed this presentation.